Hey guys, it's Jesse with CADimensions, and today we're going to learn how to go fast and visualize professional. We'll be adding motion blur to our renderings to create the illusion of speed. Now this is a skill level easy, but you will need Visualize Professional to get this done. At the end of the video, we'll take a look at using Visualize Standard as well as Photoshop to get similar effect.
Here's what we'll be creating today. We'll be creating this in-motion kind of shot where the object appears to be moving quickly in its environment. Now let's explore motion blur by first comparing two still images of Derek driving by. The first image I'll take with a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second. This is how long the camera is taking to get the shot. At this shutter speed, we see quite a bit of motion blur in the image. Now, if we take another image of Derek going roughly the same speed, but this time with a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, we see very little motion blur. So why is this? Well, motion blur is caused by the object moving while the camera is exposing the image. In rendering, we don't expose an image per se, but the controls are designed to mimic this behavior. In this case, as the vehicle is moving, a slow shutter speed gives the car more time to move in the time that the shutter is open. A faster shutter speed simply opens and closes so fast that the car doesn't move much in that span of time. So more motion blur would be the result of a slower shutter or a faster moving object.
Now, predictably, it gets more complicated than that. When we move from still imagery into video work, we've got 24, maybe more still images per second that we've got to worry about the shutter speed on. So now we see that our shutter speed is going to be related to our frame rate. Now, old film cameras used a disc, and they had a pie slice cut out of that disc. So as the disc was spinning, each frame was going by at a certain speed, whatever frame rate you're shooting at. And that pie slice is called the shutter angle. Now, the shutter angle, however wide that is, would allow more or less exposure of each frame. So now we've got the shutter angle, the shutter speed, we've got frame rate to worry about. So why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you this so you appreciate how easy they've made it in Visualize to get motion blur looking right. Just be thankful that you don't have to set the exposure with ND filters after all that. Let's go check it out.
Now, as we move into the software, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised as to how easy it is to create an image that pops, like the one that we just saw earlier. Let's start right from the very beginning. So here I have the model kind of just freshly imported from SolidWorks, and we'd like to set up a scene that sort of mimics the image that we saw before. I set things up in this type of a scenario really in this order. I'll do the scene, then set up the shot, and then set up the spin. So I find it helpful to kind of get it into the environment that it's going to be in so I can see what's going on and then sort of match up the motion blur to how I feel the image should look. So let's start things right off with the scene, and to do that I'll start off with the back plate. Now the back plate, I found this image on Pixabay, and this particular image I found I kind of liked the scene sort of looking out over the cliffs into this kind of cloudy sky. But one of the nice things with Pixabay is that they often will give you information, or the photographer uploads the information that they used when they took the shot. So if we scroll down here a little bit, we can see what camera he or she used when they took the image, and more importantly, it gives us what lens they used when they took the shot. So here they're claiming they used a 28 millimeter. So this gives us a little bit of a peek into how they created this image, which gives us a leg up when we get to rendering with it. Now, the only thing that I did with this image is I cropped it down a little bit just to match the 16:9 aspect ratio that I wanted, since this was destined for the web. So that was really the only change that I made to it. So let's apply that image as a backplate in our Visualize project. All we have to do is drag that in from Windows Explorer. So I've got the image here. I'll drag that right in, and that will set that as the background for the scene. Now let's set the scene itself. So we want to adjust our lighting to sort of match. Right now I have one of the default scenes loaded, which is just the Auto Photo Studio. But I have created a HDR Light Studio, which I just dropped this image in to create similar lighting. Now, this isn't really required. You could use any of these generic HDR environments and find something that sort of matches up with it, kind of light on the top and dark on the bottom. Or even better, if you can find one with some clouds in there, that would probably be ideal. Now, we don't really have too much in the way of really crisp reflection, so we probably won't see much of the detail details in there, so you could really probably get away with just about anything. With HDR Light Studio, it took me 2 seconds to stick the image in, so I just decided to use that. So I'll apply that as my my environment, and there's a couple things that I want to do with this. We can see that underneath here I'm sort of getting this ground shadow, which is nice if you're in a studio environment, but not so nice if the thing is supposed to be flying through the air. So that's what we have here. So in this scene, I'll come along down towards the bottom and I'll turn off my floor shadow for starters, and now we just need to match things up to the environment a little bit. So we can move things around, maybe rotate them a little bit. This is a fairly kind of flat scene, so it's not too critical here. Just try to get things, I actually don't even mind that. Just rotating the environment around. In this case, I was using the keyboard shortcut, Control Alt and the left click, but of course I have my Scenes tab open, so I could have just used my slider right here. At this point, I think I'd like to brighten this up a little bit. So let's bring that up a notch. Again, using the keyboard shortcut to do that, but again, through the tab would be fine as well. Keyboard shortcut for brightness, control, and the brackets, right bracket for increasing by 0.25 and left bracket for decreasing. And I'll push the gamma down a little bit just for maybe a little extra contrast. We'll stick somewhere in the middle. That looks good. Keyboard shortcuts for those, control and semicolon and apostrophe. At this point, we want to get this sort of fitting into the scene. So I will push this back a little bit. We'll zoom out a hair, and let's see if we can get this focal length to match what it would look like in this particular image, as if it were taken as part of this image. So I'll move over to my cameras tab here, and I only have one camera in this project, so it is already selected. And from here, we can make adjustments to the camera itself. Now, the focal length is the one that I want to make adjustments to the most. Usually, I will adjust the focal length by holding Alt on my keyboard and then just scrolling my middle mouse button. But in this case, I have kind of a specific value that I want to try out, so I'll put that right in the camera tab here. So we'll set this to 28 millimeters. And we'll push in and see how that looks when it's zoomed in a little bit. Yeah, that's not too bad. I kind of like that. We'll move that around, maybe push that up a bit, make it look like it's kind of flying through the air here. Yeah, that kind of works. All right, so again, you can mess with this a little bit and kind of, adjust back and forth, but it's kind of nice having some idea where the image came from, because that gives you definitely a good starting point to find the right perspective for matching up your model with the background image. Now, at this point, we're pretty much ready to go to start setting up our rotations, in this case for the motion blur. So let's actually increase the size of this a little bit just so we can see a little better what's going on here. That'll work. What we want to do is use a combination of how quick the object is moving as well as how long the shutter is open. So we've looked at that with the example of Derek's car kind of going by, and it works exactly the same in Visualize. So we need to move the components. In this case, we need to rotate them. And again, this is why we need Visualize Pro to get this done. So we'll animate the components in their motion, and then we'll use that animation as the input essentially for our camera's motion blur. Now, fortunately for us, this is quite simple to do, and especially simple when we have a rotation. If I select one of these blades here, let me use my part selection here for a moment, and I'll select one of these blades. Now, when selecting these blades, we need to know where the center of this piece is so that we can rotate it about that point. And you'll see that if you select any one of these parts, you'll notice that there is actually a control for pivot center. So you can adjust where the pivot is with its XYZ location. You can recenter that to the part or the environment center, or you can adjust that manually if you use the pivot manipulation tool. So if I select the pivot manipulation tool, we see that my pivot is kind of in the middle, but then I have a triad by which I can move that around and rotate about some other center if I want to. This happens to be in the right location already for each one of these blades, so that works perfectly. In this case, the hole is right in the middle as well, so I could also just center my pivot to part, and that would work fine if it were not in the center for some reason to begin with. So in this case, our pivot is in the right locations. So all we need to do is spin these around. Now this couldn't be easier. All we have to do is select the component that we'd like to rotate, right click on it, and at the bottom you'll see an option for add rotation animation. So I'll do that. At this point we don't see anything happening. So we need to turn on our timeline to gain access to the controls for what this is doing as far as rotating things for us. I use Control L to do that, but you can also go up to View and Show Timeline. Now from here, we see that it's added an animation for us. So from 0 seconds to 5 seconds, it is rotating this component around once. So we see that as I move my playhead through, we see my blade spinning around. Okay, let's do the same thing for the other 3. So I will right click, add a rotation, right click, add a rotation, and again for the 4th. Now, we talked about motion blur being a combination of how long the shutter is opening and how fast the component is moving with respect to that shutter. Let's adjust our shutter settings now. So we'll go up to our camera tab, and from our camera controls, if we slide down, you'll see there is a control for enabling motion blur. So all we have to do is check on, yes, I want to see motion blur happening. And you'll see underneath that we have now control for shutter time. Now you'll notice this is shutter time in milliseconds. So we don't have to worry about shutter angle or shutter speed in fractions of a second or anything like that. We can say, here's how long I want the shutter to be open. Here's how fast my objects are moving. Okay, so the animation is controlling how quickly things are going. The shutter time is controlling how long the shutter is open. Now, in this case, we can use either one to really adjust what's happening here. Let's take a look in the animation section first. If I were to double click on one of these animations in between the keys, you'll see that will bring up the animation properties. And from within the animation properties, I can adjust things like the rotation in this case, since it's a rotation animation. Now I could also reverse this. I could say -360, or I could say 1080, make this go 3 times in that, 3 times around over the span of that 5 seconds. All right, so that would speed things up. Now we also have the ability to move where these keys are. If this is even still one rotation over the course of 5 seconds, if I were to move that endpoint for these closer down to half a second or less, we'll see that that will speed up the rotation. All right, so that's how we control how quickly our components are moving. Now again, we can control how long the shutter is open here. Now, we don't see any effects of this at this point. So let's move ourselves over into our accurate rendering mode, and now we'll start to see what's going on here. So as soon as we start rendering in accurate, immediately we start seeing these move a little bit. All right, so we start to see that motion. Now, if I were to extend the amount of time or speed up the motion, we would see more motion blur. So I have these relatively quick at this point. Let's extend the amount of time that the shutter is taking. We'll slide that out to 50 or so. Now we see that the blade has more time to move over the course that the shutter is open. So we're getting more of a trail out of that. Now, of course, any motion that's happening in these animations will get blurred at the same rate. So you could also move the entire quad together if you wanted some streaking on the entire model. But in something like this, usually if you were photographing this, you would do something that's called a panning shot. So the camera would be following the object and the background would actually blur rather than the object itself. Since the object is the focus, we kind of want that crisp, but we like the spinning of the blades. Now you could probably fake that in Visualize by having kind of something move in the background with the image. But to be honest, you're probably better off just adding some blur to the image and then using that blurred image as the backplate. So you could do something like this, where if you use a blurred backplate, you can kind of sell the effect even more. All right, maybe we'll bump up the brightness a little bit more. Again, small tweaks after that. At this point, we've accomplished our goal and we're ready to output render. I would probably recommend adding a few extra passes over what you normally would, only because the spinning objects you can see might take a little bit, a few more passes to actually render those out. So I would extend those a little bit and you'll end up with an image that looks something like this.
Whew. Well, I hope you learned something about adding motion blur to your renderings and Visualize. We'll see you guys next time. Oh, I need to work out.
You're still here. Oh, that's right. I promised I would show some Photoshop at the end. So if you guys don't have Visualize Professional, you can't spin things in Visualize and get that motion blur, there is a workaround. So what I would do is I would isolate the blades and the body itself, and then render them as two separate images. So in order to do that, let's grab our part selection here. Actually, you know what? Let's do it right from the tree. So if we come over to the tree, let's expand this out a little bit so we can see what we're doing here. And I'll come find the blades themselves. So we have a blade here, we have a blade here, we've got a blade here and a blade here. What I'll do is I'll create a new group from these, not required, but I think will be kind of convenient. So I'll just say create new group. And what that group will do is just give me the blades themselves. So from here, what I'd like to do is turn the blades off. I know what we're trying to do is make them move, but I'll turn them off initially. So I'll uncheck visible, and that leaves me with just the rest of the quad without the blades. From here, I'll come up to my output tools, assuming you've got everything else set, and I'll give this a name. So I'll give it, say, call it body or whatever you want to call it. And what you want to make sure you check on here is include alpha. What we want to do is isolate only the quad itself. So we don't want the background, we don't want the blades or anything else. We just want the quad. So check on include alpha and make sure you're using an image format that will support it. So a TIFF or a PNG. And from there, you can choose your render settings. I just have this set to run for a couple thousand passes. Say okay and start render. All right, so render that out and that will end you with just this image isolated. Now what we want to do is do the opposite. So from here, I'll select the rest of these and we'll uncheck visible for those. For my blades, I want to bring those back, and now we have just the blades. All right, so same process. We'll go in, we'll output, we'll call these blades Photoshop. All right, use the same render settings, get those right the first time and just leave them. Again, we still want to include alpha channel and start render. What this allows us to do, and I've pre-rendered these just for convenience, what this allows us to do is isolate each group independently. So now I can put my backplate in Photoshop and I can go access the two images that I just created. So we have the body itself, which we can see has sort of transparency, so it shows up with just the quad. And we have the blades. All right, and you'll see they land right where they were because they're all three the same image size. So now I have independently selectable layer for my blades. I have an independent layer for the quad and just the backplate itself. Okay, now these came in as smart layers, so I will rasterize those real quick so we can work with them. Now what we want to do is to blur only the blades, and we can do that by going to filter. Sorry, let's select our blade layer here. We'll give this a name. Blade and body. Okay. So on our blade layer, what we want to do again is come up to filter through the blur gallery, and we want to use a spin blur. Now, if you're not using CC, then you won't have access to these. You'll have to use the original radial blur, in which case you'll have to actually split each one off into their own blade, and that becomes a little bit more difficult. But in this case, we'll use the spin blur to get this accomplished, and we'll pull this over to our first blade here, and we'll kind of match things up. Now, at this point, we've got to kind of figure out the perspective ourselves. We're sort of stuck with what we've got here, but We can kind of eyeball this and try to make this look like that would be the right perspective for that spinning, and then we can control how much blur we would like on these. Now notice that the blur is only being applied to the blade because that's the only thing on that layer. Now if you didn't have something underneath, you might be able to get away with not doing this in 2 layers, but because these are spinning over the top of an arm and things like that, we can't really motion blur the arm as well, so we have to do these in 2 separate layers. All right, so we'll set that there and we'll say okay to that. That doesn't look too bad, and then we'll do that 3 more times. So blur gallery, spin blur, and we'll apply this here. Again, try to get this perspective. And I'll just speed this up in post to save some time as I go through the other 3. All right, so not quite as clean as the visualized created one looks, and of course if you have a combination of motions that can make things more difficult, but certainly a valid workaround if you didn't have visualized professional. Now you can just save this out as a single image and move along. Well, thanks for watching this episode of Model Everything through CAD Dimensions, and I hope we see you next time.